Good evening, and a very warm welcome to you all to the big dialogue, climate change. What can we agree on? We are so happy, and I have to say a little relieved to see you all here tonight in person in the beautiful, congenial Tivoli, a wonderful setting for the civilised expression of different and divergent views. My name is Helen Chenery and I'm President of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we are delighted to be collaborating tonight on this event with the Brisbane Dialogues. The Academy, now in its 21st year, comprises some 140 fellows and members and has an active supporter base. It exists to encourage and promote the advancement of the arts and sciences by recognising outstanding achievement and scholarly research and inquiry. But as we know, there are already many learned academies that aspire to that. Our point of difference is that we seek to stimulate activity in those areas that lie at the intersection or the blurry boundaries between and among disciplines. By actively searching for and making connections, both personal and professional, and by providing opportunities that facilitate a broad discussion of issues of major public policy interest and, importantly, that lead to some observable outcomes, usually in the form of providing independent scholarship and advice. To those of you not familiar with the Brisbane Dialogues, well, this relatively new organisation, I have to admit, is already making a big impact and attracting great support, as witnessed by a sold-out crowd tonight. It aims to stimulate better discussion about big ideas and issues, not just civil ones, but enjoyable, enlightening, productive, accessible ones, between, once again, people of very different perspectives. And tonight is certainly an example of that. And I think it's why the collaboration between the Academy and the Brisbane Dialogues is so important. The Brisbane Dialogues is a wholly independent, neutral, intergenerational, not-for-profit, all-volunteer project. So while the Brisbane Dialogue demonstrates what better discussions might look like on the public stage and conducts its own private ones, its ultimate mission is to support other organisations, public and private, to hold better discussions, turning one-way talks and one-sided panels into genuine dialogues. If I could turn to the slide now by J.S. Mill, he who knows only his own case knows little of that, is so much the underpinning of the collaboration here tonight and the mission of both our organisations. Previous Brisbane Dialogue MCs have used the occasion to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the place on which we are gathered by making meaningful reference to a principle underpinning the rich tradition of dialogue in Indigenous culture. These principles have been created from discussions with the Brisbane Dialogues Indigenous Advisor, and I reference one of them this evening on behalf of all of us present. And the principle that we've chosen to reference tonight is this: decisions are respected and implemented. Decisions are respected and implemented. Now, the background to this from Indigenous culture is that matters under discussion and decision were sometimes serious and personal. So the decision process had to be respected if escalation was to be avoided and resolution reached. So whilst we continue the dialogue again here tonight, acknowledging that the process is important, at some point the decisions that must be made need to be respected and implemented. And we acknowledge this wisdom handed down over tens of thousands of years. And for tonight's purpose, I paraphrase as, we are going to have to just get on with it. Just a few thank you nows before I introduce our panellists. On behalf of everyone here, huge thank you to all the volunteers, particularly the content, marketing and event teams of the Brisbane Dialogues and the executive of the Queensland Academy. The whole Big Dialogues series might not be happening tonight, and certainly not as successfully if it weren't for the Tivoli owners, Dave and Steve Selswick. Their generosity, patience and practical support, and that of their very successful Tivoli staff, is extraordinarily and very gratefully received, and especially noting that we're in such a difficult and uncertain time in their industry. Just to let you know that they are refurbishing and reopening the historic Princess Theatre across the river in the Gabba, producing and expanding their open season of live music and comedy across both those venues over the year. So if the discussion of big ideas and issues becomes too much, there's plenty of light relief to be had on other nights at the Tiv and the Princess. And certainly, thank you all for coming tonight. Without you, the Big Dialogue just would not happen. And a huge thanks to the many who paid more than the above cost price of the black and blue tickets or made donations. This is what makes the Big Dialogue series widely accessible and inclusive. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. So turning to tonight's discussion, which, if past experience suggests, is one of the more complex and emotive topics to present in an already fractious world. There is only one rule for tonight, and it's been created by the Brisbane Dialogue and thoroughly endorsed by the Academy. And this rule states, all participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on characters, before, during and afterwards, online as well as offline. That's a pretty decent rule, I think. Many of you have emailed questions for the speakers already. Thank you for doing that. There are still opportunities to do so, and questions can be sent by SMS to the number on the screen, and this will remain visible to you during the panel discussion. Some of these questions might be considered during the main discussion, and some will be allocated to respond to others later. Now we have a short welcome video from Anna Bligh, former politician and currently Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Banking Association, to play now. Thank you.
Hello everybody. I'm so disappointed that I can't be with you for this event. Unfortunately, COVID has prevented that, but I wish you all the best for your deliberations on this very, very important topic. I do want to commend the Brisbane Dialogues for the work that they're doing to try to find ways that we can debate and consider and think about difficult, thorny and controversial issues and in ways that bring us towards agreement about things that can make the situation better, that can find solutions. There are very few, I think, topics in recent times that have been as fiercely, emotionally, passionately and often quite irrationally debated as climate change and its implications for all of us. So tonight's topic, I think, will present you with some real challenges about how to have a debate and find agreement. Since leaving politics, I have spent most of my time working in corporate Australia, particularly in the finance and banking sectors. And what I've found in those sectors is that the issue of climate change is one that is very much on the top of the agenda. On the top of the agenda for corporate boards, for their executive teams, for their investors, their shareholders and for their regulators. And this is an issue on which increasingly agreement has been and continues to be found by discussing the matter in a thoughtful, rational and careful way. And I tell you that not because I think that corporate Australia is by any means getting this perfectly right, but what I can say is that they have found much to agree on. There is agreement that climate change is a material risk. There is agreement that it is a foreseeable risk and an actionable risk, and an agreement that boards and companies should be acting. And I tell you that because I hope it inspires you and gives you hope that in your deliberations tonight, you can do exactly the same. Find the things that you can agree on. Good luck.
Excellent. Well, now let's bring our panellists onto the stage. Could we please welcome Professor Hugh Possingham, Queensland Chief Scientist. Our second panellist is Dr. Maia Schweizer, CEO of CleanCo Queensland. Our third panellist is Graham Young, Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Progress. And a very warm welcome to our moderator this evening, Julieanne Alroe, Chair of Infrastructure Australia and Queensland Ballet. Over to you, Julieanne.
Just stay here for a minute. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Helen said, my name is Julieanne Alroe. As you'll have noted from my CV, which was on the invitations, I'm nowadays a non-executive director, and I do sit on a couple of boards that are involved in public policy and administration. And I do want to stress that I'm not here tonight to speak on behalf of any of these organisations. Rather, I'm here mainly because John Anderson couldn't be. John had agreed to moderate this discussion but was unable to attend due to the New South Wales border closure. John says he regrets and hopes that he'll be able to join us at another occasion. But also I'm here tonight because I support the aim of the Brisbane Dialogues to promote genuine and respectful dialogue to help find common ground and a workable solution to difficult problems. I'm also a fellow of the Queensland Academy of the Arts and Sciences, and I wish to support the Academy in our aim to facilitate a broad dialogue on major public policy issues. We may never agree on much about climate change, its exact nature, the causes, severity, urgencies. But what might we agree upon and what to do about it in terms of practical policies, grassroots measures, either on energy alternatives, public technology investments, private sector decarbonisation, adaptation, conservation, development assistance. Tonight's program brings us a range of speakers who I hope will shed light rather than just noise on this issue. The program tonight is that each of our speakers will make some introductory remarks covering on why they are interested in participating in this dialogue and their general position on the topics. But just prior to starting, I would like to show you a brief video from Robin Batterham, Chair of Net Zero Australia and the former Chief Scientist of Australia. Robin was originally to be a speaker tonight, but also had to pull out due to border closures. And I'd just like to say a special thank you for Graham for stepping in at short notice. After we've finished with Robin's video, we'll then move, and the introductory remarks, we'll then move on to some questions to help the discussions get going on to try and find out what we can agree on and what the practical measures, public and private, that we could support. There will also be time to pose questions that have been received from the audience, so please send your questions to the number Helen raised on the screen earlier. The 18th century French essayist Joseph Joubert wrote, "The aim of an argument or a discussion should not be victory, but progress." So, on that sound guidance, let's start the proceedings by listening to Robin's video. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robin Batterham, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you tonight, but I think you understand the reasons why. This topic of climate is very divisive. You have over half of the Australian population either alarmed or concerned, and the other half ranging all the way through to it doesn't even exist as a problem. Now, on the science side, there's good agreement on most aspects, but not all. For example, there's no problem measuring CO2 from burning fossil fuels as being different to the rest of the CO2 in the atmosphere. But we have the broad issue of causality, and it really doesn't get enough debate. We have this: temperatures are rising, CO2 is rising, and therefore CO2 is the cause because our models tell us so. Well, there are a few things that sit there that give us cause to debate that. For example, the disastrous floods in Germany at the moment, very sad, but they're no higher than what happened in 1268. And yet CO2 is now twice as high. So what's going on here? And the roughly 1,000-year cycle that we've had for the last 10,000 years since the last ice age, hot spells, cold, hot spells, cold, 1,000-year cycle roughly. The Little Ice Age, many of you would be familiar with that. The Roman warm period with malaria in London and so forth. CO2 didn't vary through all of those cycles, but it is varying in this most recent one. So what's different? Another major issue is water vapour, which NASA points out is simply the most important greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And with 2 to 3% of water vapour in the atmosphere, that's 20 to 30,000 parts per million. Compare that with 400 parts per million of CO2. In other words, 50 to 75 water molecules for every one molecule of CO2, when they've got similar absorption properties for radiation. Why is CO2 the villain? Don't know. These things can't even be debated on the science side because it's supposedly all settled. So what do we do about this? There are lots of issues around climate, and it's hard to have the debate, so good luck tonight. My opinion, for what's that worth, as a mathematical modeller from way back and an engineer, is I have some sense of the power and the shortcomings of models. And as such, I'm comfortable to say, wow, emissions could be quite a serious problem. So let's reduce them when we can, especially when there are co-benefits of so doing. A good example of this is soil carbon, and John Anderson is a champion in this particular area. Go for more soil carbon. It takes carbon out of the atmosphere, it stores it to long term. It gives better productivity, less fertiliser, less runoff, better drought resilience and so on. For heaven's sake, get on with it. Then there are plenty of other examples where there are long-term benefits, better insulation of houses. Instead of burning electricity to do our air conditioning, why don't we have heat pumps which go down into the ground instead of just to the atmosphere? Examples abound of where we can make changes to our emissions profile without drastic economic penalties. Princeton University has recently completed a study of how you can get to zero in North America. A very, very detailed study, the first that's considered the totality of the system. And it says, yes, you can do it, and it'll cost you a order 0.5% of GDP per year. And we're just starting a study in Australia, which will hopefully take some of the heat out of the debate. Unfortunately, the results won't be available for 2 years. So this is an area where we need cool, calm, rational debate, not extremes. It is important, and I wish you well for tonight's activities.
I am getting a bit concerned that everyone keeps wishing our speakers luck. I don't think they're really going to need it, but let's get started, and let's start with Maia. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julieanne. I'm the daughter of 2 astronomers, and I grew up bushwalking, very much aware of the sky above me, but also the earth below me, and ultimately I went on to study geology, paleontology, the availability of other planets to support life and things like that. But one moment that really sticks with me that's relevant to tonight is I remember very clearly when I was a little girl in the early 90s, and I saw television coverage of Brazil's rainforests burning to make room to raise more cattle. And I remember thinking so clearly as an 8-year-old or 9-year-old, thinking, that can't go on, right? That can't go on. Surely that's not sustainable. And I wouldn't have used that word at the time, but intuitively I knew it was wrong. And then I kind of forgot about it. I think for 30 years I thought it was so obvious that that was not okay, and that the various other things that we were doing to the planet were not okay. And I just assumed it was so obvious someone else was doing something about it. And then I got a little bit older and a little bit wiser, and I realized, no, we're not. Perhaps I'd better. And so I'm really, really glad to be here tonight. I'm really glad to be able to engage in this dialogue, because I think it is really difficult to talk about climate change, and it has been really difficult. One of the things I wondered is why, when it was so obvious to me, why why aren't we doing something about it? And it is really difficult. And I think it's difficult for a few reasons that we have to acknowledge. One is that it's mostly not happening here. The worst effects, the earliest effects, most of the extreme events are happening elsewhere to people far away we don't relate to. Increasingly, of course, it is happening in our backyard, in our lungs, in our businesses. It seems like it's far off, and for a long time it was, but it's not anymore. We have less than a decade until we've used up the carbon budget that reasonably safely might keep us below 1.5 degrees C of warming for the world, and I'm sure we'll come back to what that means a little bit more later. It is uncertain. There's a lot that's certain, and there's a lot that's been proven, but there are uncertainties, and that makes it difficult to pin down exactly what we can do. But I guess as I really got into it, and as I realized perhaps I'd better try to do something about it, I discovered something really quite wonderful, and I think that's probably something that we might talk about quite a bit tonight, which is that it no longer needs to be difficult. A tipping point has been reached wherein mitigation of climate change is advantageous on almost every front. To quote John Kerry, whose speech marking 100 days into the COP26 discussions in Glasgow I recently watched, "We are facing the greatest market transformation with the greatest economic promise since the Industrial Revolution." And what he's talking about there is mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. I'm glad Robin mentioned it. I have in hand the modelling for Queensland, what it would take to get to net zero in Queensland, and I'm happy to say that that thesis holds true here as well. And so it shouldn't be hard to talk about climate change anymore, and I very much look forward to the conversation this evening. Thank you.
Okay, Hugh.
Thanks, Julieanne. Let me begin. We had a lovely acknowledgement of country. I also like to do an acknowledgement of privilege. So I'm a ridiculously overeducated white Australian male from a middle-class background. So in the end, everything I've achieved is actually everybody else's doing, not my own. Let me start with that. Let me also start by saying I'm a failed mathematician. I was a senior lecturer in maths and a fairly rubbishy scientist. So what am I doing here? As Chief Scientist Queensland, was that a clerical error? Maybe. I've sort of created a career out of decision science, and let me explain that, and this is a true story. I woke up this morning having had a dream. This isn't a religious talk. I had a dream, and this is actually true. The dream I had last night that I woke up to, my nightmare, was sitting around a table with a group of academics and senior bureaucrats and industry people, and we were trying to make a decision, not about climate change, just any sort of decision, a decision about prioritising investments in activities, and they were using scores and adding them up. And I was getting really angry trying to explain to them that that decision-making process they were using was completely flawed. That's how nerdy I am. That is my dream last night. And that's how I've built my career, is transporting very rudimentary applied mathematics and economic thinking into environmental science to a whole group of people who aren't that great about quantitative stuff, and telling them, if you really want to calculate the return on investment from an activity, the benefit divided by the cost, you need to quantify those things. You can't turn cost into a score out of 10 and add it on to the benefit. It doesn't really work like that. And those of you who are in the room who are educated in engineering, economics and mathematics will know the inanity of decision-making. That sort of scoring-based decision-making is my nightmare, and it is routine and rife amongst all of society. I can't tell you how many times I've had to make this speech. And it is very odd that so many decisions in society are made so poorly. So to the point of climate change, all I really care about, and my job as the Chief Scientist of Queensland, is to provide not only rational information about what is right and what is wrong, but also try and bring rational decision-making tools to the table. cost effectiveness, cost utility analysis, multi-criteria decision analysis, trade-off curves. And I think that's what, it doesn't really sound that hard. You would have thought it happened every day. It doesn't happen, and almost doesn't happen anywhere. It doesn't even happen in universities, in senates and departmental meetings. There is very little rigour to the way we invest our resources. So if anything, I'll be saying tonight, what are the benefits of a particular set of actions? And that's where actually environmental and conservation science becomes very difficult. If you're just interested in running a company and a business, then benefits are measured in cost, and you do cost-benefit analysis, benefits minus cost. But in the world of the environment, we have things like the ecosystem, we have things like human health, and we have money, and we have even other things that are quite hard to quantify and measure, like equity between people. And can you quantify them all? You can quantify all of those things. You can put metrics on them. How do you combine them in a rational way and do the trade-offs? And I think that's what bedevils society across the board when you've got multiple players, all who have different and quite hard and often hidden benefit functions. And this is where the action comes in, of all the possible actions we can take. How do you look at all those benefit functions and combine them across a group of people and come up with decision-making that makes some sort of sense? Let me end. So that's my obsession, and I have dreams about them. I have nightmares about them. But one thing I'd like to sort of throw on the table, my passion is bird watching. I love the environment. I've devoted my life to trying to conserve the environment. In some senses, actually, I think, let me be heretical and say climate change in 100 years' time will have sorted it all out, and people will wonder why we were so worried about it, because it wasn't that hard. But then at that point in time, we will have wiped out half the species on the planet, and we will be thinking, why weren't we talking about that? That's my prediction. The good thing is I'll be dead, so I won't be proven wrong. Bottom line is, you think that climate change is a tough job because of the time lags, and, basically it's like littering. Putting out carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide is like littering, and having the litter randomly appear somewhere in the planet 30 years later. How do you stop littering? You can stop it if you drop in front of your feet, but how do you stop it when it appears 30 years later at a random point in the planet? Well, biodiversity loss is going to haunt us for thousands and thousands of years, and we are well and truly on track to wipe out half the species on the planet. Strangely enough, I don't think climate change is going to affect biodiversity that much, and you might say, why? And what's the biggest climate change experiment we're doing at the moment? Every city in the world. How much warmer is every city in the world than it would have been if there was no city there? 3, 4 degrees Celsius warmer. Have the trees stopped growing? Have the birds stopped singing? They're certainly not the diversity you would have once expected. But ecosystems don't completely fall to pieces. Nature is better at dealing with climate change than we are. I think there's largely a human problem. It's going to hurt us more than a lot of nature. It will hurt nature. There's already extinctions from climate change. Habitat destruction is wiping out species and invasive species. So I just want to put that on the table, that we probably won't get much back to biodiversity. That's the other elephant in the room that we may not want to deal with, or maybe deal with it on another night. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. I might just remind you they did dig up Cromwell and hang him. So if you are wrong, we probably will leave a note somewhere to get you. Okay, Graham.
Being on this panel, we get wished good luck by Robin, and then Hugh volunteers he's not going to be around for much longer. I'm wondering about my own mortality. Climate change is something that has interested me since, I guess, the 70s. I missed the bit about the global cooling, but I certainly picked up pretty quickly on the idea that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and I think one thing we can all agree on here as a starting point is that it is a greenhouse gas. It does make the world a bit warmer than it would otherwise have been. The argument is about how much warmer and what other contributing factors there are. And after paying attention to it for about 10 years, I stopped worrying about it. And it was about 20 years ago, I guess, that I picked it up again as an issue. And the reason I picked it up as an issue was I thought it was a problem that needed to be solved, but the more I looked at it, the less of a problem that it seemed, And the problem seemed to me to be in what people were saying, people who held themselves out as scientists about the role of CO2 in making the Earth warmer. So I'm pretty relaxed about climate change. The man who first put his finger on the phenomenon lived in Sweden, and he thought that if it was a couple of degrees warmer, that would be a good thing. And I think he was probably right. I think it's an open question as to what the optimal level of CO2 would be in the Earth. If you were to design the Earth from scratch, how much CO2 would you put in there? You know, it's a plant food. And in fact, at levels that we went down to in the last ice age, we were in danger of starving the plants on this planet. So a bit more CO2 is a good idea. When they grow plants in hothouses, they amp it up to about 800 parts per million or even higher because it makes it grow faster. People worry about higher temperatures making some parts of the Earth uninhabitable. They might not have noticed, but there's a whole continent that's uninhabitable at the moment because it's too bloody cold, and that's Antarctica. So, you know, there's pluses and minuses in all of this, and I think that issue is not settled. However, a lot of people in this room and a lot of people around the world and a lot of the people who make decisions have decided that we have an urgent problem, that if we don't deal with it in the next 10 years, we're all going to fry. I think the geological record actually contradicts that. If you go back over time, you'll find that CO2's been up to 4,000 parts per million. That's 10 times where it is at the moment. And it's actually been colder at the time. You'll find in the last 10,000 years, it was warmer at the beginning of the Holocene than it is now. So, you know, we've dealt with higher temperatures, we've dealt with higher concentrations of CO2. The Great Barrier Reef's managed to thrive through the whole lot of it. So I don't think it's an urgent issue, but if enough of my fellow human beings think it's an urgent issue, then it's one that I have to accept that point of view, and then I've got to start looking at, so what are the least risk, the least costly ways of dealing with this fear that other people have. So we're going to electrify the economy. A lot of people don't realise that that doesn't just mean replacing every power plant we've got at the moment. It means multiplying them by 3 and replacing them. Because you're not just going to replace the electricity that comes into your house, you've got to electrify the transport sector. There's a whole lot of industrial processes. So the estimate is somewhere around 2.5, 3 times the amount of electricity production. It takes a long time to build things. You have to find the resources. If you're living in a world where 8 billion people are trying to do the same thing at the same time, there'll be a shortage of resources. You've probably been reading about the increase in the price of lumber, timber at the moment, difficulties in getting your house renovated or a new house built, because everyone, not just here, but around the world are trying to do the same things at the same time. So there's some significant bottlenecks out there if you try and electrify everything just at the same time that everyone is and doing it in a hurry. Fortunately, I think we've got hundreds of years to worry about this. We also, when you're looking at electrification, we're not putting ideal forms of power generation in. We're putting these intermittent, unreliable renewables. Now, that has flow-on problems. One of it is that actually the most expensive part of your power bill is the network charges. It's not actually the production of the electricity. And to deal with these forms of generation, you need much more extensive networks. They need to be carrying the electricity in both directions. You also need to have storage of some sort. And once you get past 25, 30% of this form of electricity production in the network, then without the storage, then you start getting some real issues in terms of being able to provide electricity. There's also a cost issue. There's a direct straight line relationship between civilization and how much power we use. You'll see it all over the world. When people get richer, they burn more coal, oil, use more electricity, etc. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So it's a very complex area. I love that sort of complexity. I'm not a scientist like these two. I did an arts degree at uni, but I went to school in Queensland in the 70s and I did physics and chemistry. And if you went to school in the 70s in Queensland and did physics and chemistry and maths, that was the best level of teaching that we've had in the last 50 years. So you can be well equipped with a high school education to look at a lot of these issues and actually understand what's going on. So for me, it's a challenge. For me, it's a benefit to the community. And it's also something that I've been pretty passionate about looking at for 40 years.
Okay, so let's start to see what we can all agree on. So acknowledging, both from Anna and from what the panel have said, that the rest of the world is moving on this. So we do need to address carbon at this point. So I think the question I'd like to throw to the panel is to what extent is the net reduction in carbon emissions the key to responding to climate change relative to other measures? And what other measures should we be considering? So start with Maia. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fantastic question, and what a wonderful challenge to focus only on what we think we're going to agree on. So here we go. So I guess the reduction of carbon is, in my view, the single biggest thing that we can do to avert the worst impacts of climate change. Notwithstanding the points that others have made, and a tantalizing foray into the geologic record, it is what the IPCC has declared is the biggest thing that we can do, is to reduce our CO2 emissions specifically, also methane, also nitrous oxides, et cetera. But really, the big focus is on CO2, just sheerly because of the volume that we're putting out. Hundreds of millions of years of carbon captured in organic forms, in our gas, in our oil, in our coal, burned in a century. Gives you a sense of the scale relative to some of these other factors and the pace relative to some of these other factors. So I do see, and there is reasonably strong consensus across the world scientists that reduction in carbon is the biggest thing that we can do. And I guess again the really I'm fundamentally optimistic about that, and the reason is because we can do that without breaking the bank. We can do that without reducing our living standards. We can do that while recognizing the cost of externalities of a fossil-fueled world. And even without those externalities, we can do that with business cases that actually make sense. As much as I'm a scientist by background this evening, I'm probably here to bring the business perspective to climate change and adaptation and mitigation. So let me just paint a little bit of a picture of what Queensland could look like in 2050. And I will admit I've only done this modeling for Queensland, but I have done it on a whole of economy basis. So it includes not just the electricity sector, but actually all the different forms of energy that we use in Queensland today and potentially into the future. So a net zero Queensland in 2050 is a lot more electrified than today. It's probably about 4 times more electrified. Today, only about 15% of our final energy use is electricity, and in the future, it'll get up to something like 60 or 65%. Why is that? Well, it turns out that electric motors are a whole lot more efficient than combustion engines or other types of fossil fuel burning engines. And so there's a huge amount of efficiency to be gained by electrifying what can be electrified. And of course, the number one example of that is transport. In fact, the vast majority of transport applications are either already better off electrified, so battery electric vehicles, for example, or will be within the next few years. So that's a huge opportunity to electrify and reduce our carbon emissions that is actually value creative. If you're not better off buying a Tesla today, you'll be much better off buying a $35,000 electric vehicle in a couple years. The next thing that works in our favor and that, I think explains why this isn't a story that's too good to be true, is that ultimately renewable energy is free. Yes, it takes capital to build wind farms, it takes capital to build solar farms, it takes capital to build the transmission to connect them, but once you've built them, they're free. There's no ongoing charge for your fuel. And so those two dynamics, the significantly improved efficiency of electric engines, electric motors relative to a combustion engine, and the fact that once you've put in the capital, renewable energy is free. And of course, we've seen these really significant 90% falls in the cost of those renewable technologies over the last 10 years. All of that together means it's possible to have a net zero Queensland. It's possible to do it without raising your household electricity bills. We've modeled that as well. It's possible to do that without breaking the bank. Now, I don't want to make it sound too easy. It's not that easy, right? There's a lot of planning, and I think one of the biggest aspects, one of the biggest success factors to get us to that future is to have a plan for how we're going to get there. How are we going to share the resources? Where's the capital going to come from? How are we going to build it at a pace that we can sustain? How are we going to look after people who might be in one sector and need to move to another, need to be reskilled and retrained? There's all of those considerations. There's also those value-creating measures, so the electrification of transport in particular, and then the decarbonization of our electricity supply, those get us about 75% of the way. And so there's still 25% that's really hard. It's not value creating today, and we don't have line of sight to how it's going to be value creating, cost positive effectively by 2050. And that's exactly what you'd expect. It's the stuff like cement, it's the stuff like green steel, green zinc, green aluminium, these really heavy industrial processes that use really high heat and that are really difficult to electrify. Some of them have been done kind of on an experimental level, but not at the kind of industrial level that we have here in Queensland. And so you still got that 25% at the end, and it's worth thinking about, but it won't stop us from starting on the first 75%. We can get 25% of the way with transport, 50% of the way with cleaning up our electricity, lowering the emissions of our electricity. And then we've kind of got a couple decades to worry about that last 25%, as well as things like land use, reforestation, ways of absorbing carbon such that we can still emit a little bit and have net zero, true net zero carbon emissions in 2050. So I think that's really the opportunity. It is the biggest thing we can do, and it's also much easier than we think. It's easier than it used to be. It's actually value creative. It won't break the bank, and it won't raise your electricity bills.
Hugh, if you want to have a comment on that, and maybe particularly the other measures, and I suppose the investment required in those areas as well.
Yeah, I agree with Maia's got a model, so that's good. I love models, and people often say, I think Robin said, the modelling's, always a bit dodgy. That's because it's a model. Remember what a model is. It's a prediction of the future. Has anybody ever predicted the future perfectly? Other than Nostradamus, I don't know, the Bible, there's a few places, but bottom line is the modelling, the reason why, our anxiety, we've got to get people used to modelling. We sort of used to COVID modelling. We've got a lot of economic and climate change modelling, and we've got to also just accept there will be uncertain. That doesn't mean it's useless. It's just incredibly important. In fact, you're all modellers because everybody predicts the future. You're all a modeller. Because you make a decision every day based on what you expect to happen. So everybody's a modeller. Some people use mathematics, some people use gut feeling. The modelling sounds very credible. I think the bottom line I'd take home from it is that the first 70% is sort of the easy bit. We should do that actually really fast. I'm a bit worried that some states and countries say, we'll do 30 by 2030. I'd do 70 by 2030 because the last bit's going to be the really, really tricky and difficult bit. In terms of other activities, of course, there's all these geoengineering activities, and they're fun to read about, geoengineering. There's putting things in the atmosphere to reflect the light, putting in sort of more long-term particles into the atmosphere fills me with mild anxiety, I suppose. There's even things about a huge bund, an underground seawall around Antarctica that will actually try and hold it together for a lot longer. And there's a lot of modelling in those papers. There's dozens of them. You should all Google geoengineering solutions to climate change because some of them are quite hysterically weird. Some of them are probably very useful because in some senses it's a backup plan and we should have them and we should have a few of them in our back pocket. Some of these putting things in the atmosphere could actually buy us a lot of time if for some reason it actually goes worse. I mean, Graham might think it's probably going to go better. Some people probably think it's going to go worse. Why not have some geoengineering solutions in our back pocket? The other thing, of course, also we know that energy demand is expected to increase massively. So, you say all these demands, the British expect to be using 2 or 3 times as much total energy by 2050 as they are now. So you know how much energy your data storage is using. Some vast amount of the world's energy is now data storage. Clean off those iPhones. Go through all those crappy pictures of the same bird that was out of focus 17 times, because that's using something like 10 or 15% of all the, you know, if we keep keeping all these photos. So I think we often underestimate that efficiency is a good thing, and everybody wins by efficiency. It's good for the economy, it's good for everything. So I think efficiency solutions are some of the things we should really pick on and really go fast on. And they're often win-win. They're very good for the economy, and nobody can complain about them. But the geoengineering ones are certainly something that does often get discounted, but we certainly need to keep in our back pocket.
Sorry, Graham, do you want to comment? Yeah.
Geoengineering fills me with dread. The thought that some lunatic somewhere, and there's some lunatics, you've seen a couple of them go into space in the last couple of weeks rather. There's some very rich people out there who come up with some interesting ideas, and I don't know that Hugh mentioned the putting the sulfuric acid up into the atmosphere idea, but you could actually do it at a reasonably cheap cost. But I don't know that I'd be as relaxed living in a world where someone was doing that as I am relaxed living in a world where you're all going to go out of here and use some sort of vehicle which uses carbon, fossil fuel at somewhere in the cycle. Even if you're driving an electric car, you know, it's a black coal-fuelled car if you're in Queensland, more or less. Brown-fuelled if you're in Victoria, it's a bit worse. In terms of the costs of this, there's a gentleman, can't think of his Christian name, but Nordhaus is his surname, and he won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and he's costed not doing anything on climate change, and it ends up on his model, and I take what Hugh says about models, that they're a guess, they're a projection, that we actually are better off with it than without it. I like looking at actual situations rather than models. So Maia says, oh, it's cheap to do this sort of stuff. And I say, okay, so if you were setting up a greenfield situation, then you wouldn't put a coal-fired power plant in there, would you? You'd put in renewables, if Maia's correct. So in that case, why are the Chinese and why are the Indians, who are industrialising large parts of their populations, putting in coal and nuclear? They're doing that because they are the cheapest, unless you think that their scientists are not as smart as ours. They're doing that because they are the cheapest, they can do it in a reasonable period of time. With all the effort that we've put into renewables, and I kind of want to put scare quotes around the renewables because people tend to limit it to solar and wind. They're not the only form of renewable. Best form of renewable is hydro. And we've got some prospects in Australia, but not a lot. But it's only about 5 or 7%, somewhere in there, of world production. When they look at renewables, I think we get up to low, somewhere around 10 or 11 or 12, but they count biomass in there. That's people burning wood for cooking and so on in the third world. And they count hydro, which is a significant source of power, particularly in places like Canada. Paraguay's completely fuelled by, or powered rather, by hydro, which is why a lot of the Bitcoin miners have set up there, because Bitcoin consumes more than a small country when it comes to electricity. But I think that just as important as dealing with CO2 emissions is ensuring that human wealth and flourishing continues. And if that means a slower uptake of electrical vehicles, then so be it. I'd also like to take issue with Maia's contention that renewable energy is free. It's not free. It's got a significant capital cost. It's somewhere around 3 times as high a capital cost as, say, a coal-fired power station. We've got very low interest rates at the moment. If interest rates go back up more to normal, and I hope they do, because that indicates the world's got back to more than normal, that means that power will be significantly more expensive. Capital assets do not last forever. They have to be replaced. So, they're starting to replace the turbines in the North Sea and so on. In fact, North Sea turbines don't last as long as they thought they were because, surprise, surprise, the marine environment is very harsh and things rust and deteriorate. So you've got to replace them. That's not free. They also only work 20 to 35% of the time. So they're inefficient in terms of the use they make of the capital. You might be much better off, if you're worried about sea level rise, for example, putting some of that money into making sure your city doesn't flood rather than trying to stop the CO2 going into the atmosphere. The figures say we haven't been very successful at stopping CO2 going into the atmosphere. And while the Chinese and the Indians are completely, for all practical intents and purposes, outside the emission system until 2030, and that's if you believe that the Chinese will keep their promises, and I don't have a lot of faith in that, then we're going to keep having CO2. So you better build in resilience because you're going to need it.
Okay, we're getting quite a lot of questions here from the floor. In fact, they're positively flooding in. So a couple have challenged that idea of the capital cost of the solar and the renewables and the integration into the grid. So I think we do need to reflect on the cost benefit analysis that's got to be understood in that place. And having spent the last 5 or 6 years trying to wrestle through Infrastructure Australia to get people to do proper cost-benefit analysis on things, we have moved more increasingly now to try and codify the way we can look at social and economic benefits. So it's not just say, tell me it's strategic or important and that you win, trying to get some measurable ways of integrating not only the economic benefit but also those other elements of the discussion. So how do we get that better decision making, that we bring all of these various factors to the table, but also open our minds, I suppose, to alternatives. And nuclear has certainly come up several times on the question, and Graham has raised it. So there are smaller nuclear plants nowadays which aren't so horrifically expensive nor take decades to build. So how do we get more sense, how do we get more rigour in that whole debate? So Hugh, you raised analysis, so you get first crack at this one.
Sensible debate. Well, I said I had nightmares about it, so...
I mean, you should join me on the IA board sometimes,
The nuclear one, certainly, it's about the only time that I can really get my wife extremely angry with me, because I often say, if we knew now what we know about coal fueling the economy and the impacts of CO2, and I do think probably that the impacts are going to be fairly serious, particularly things like sea level rise, which could now be, the last predictions, maybe 1.5, 1.8 metres by the end of the century. So yes, that the temperature thing is one thing. I just don't like the thought of 2 metres or higher sea level around the east coast of Australia, or if you looked at the east coast of the US, I think that's 40 million people are underwater. Now, of course, New Orleans, they had a smart plan for that, didn't they? They put a big wall around it. Last time I was in New Orleans, I was distressed to know that I'd spent 3 days at a conference underwater. Not really underwater, but surrounded by walls, and then I could see why those disasters happened. So it does fill me with anxiety, those consequences, the inequity of the disasters that are likely to happen from those consequences. But nuclear, I think, if Australia had gone strong 30 or 40 years ago, yes, and I would definitely be filled with anxiety if Australia stopped exporting its uranium. I think the export of Australian uranium to China and India is one of the most important things to stopping climate change. And if you look at the data, many of you probably have, the deaths per unit of power generation from nuclear to coal coal is 10 to 100 times kills as many more people than nuclear. So, but for some reason, getting back to the rational decision making, Australians were convinced, you know, when we were young, around 15, well, when I was 15 or 20 years old, that nuclear was the devil. And I think that at the heart of most Australians, they still feel that. And so in some senses, I just don't bother putting it back on the table unless I'm really wanting to piss my wife off. Because it's just not, like, let's be honest, we could talk about it all night. I've done cost-benefit analysis. There's a great paper by one of my colleagues, Barry Brook, about all the benefits of nuclear, and he's a conservation scientist and an environmentalist. Maybe some of these small-scale devices will be useful, but I don't think Australia's going to go into large-scale nuclear. If we had 40 years ago and provided 20% of our base load for nuclear, I think we'd be in a much better position, like France and Germany, to meet these very rapid decarbonisation projections that they can do. Let me add on that, of course, the thing that fills me with great anxiety, regardless of whether or not it's good for the planet or not, the Europeans and probably the United States are going to start to not trade with us unless we move faster. So again, you can argue about the good, the bad, the cost-benefit analysis. Is it going to cost 0.5% of our GDP? Well, I think Australians are filthy rich. I don't really care if we lose 0.5% of our GDP. Is it 4% or is it 3.5%? You know, if it's a chance to save the planet. But the Europeans are going to probably, and the Americans are going to force us to do it through trade.
But if we assume that we have to look at decarbonisation and integrated grids with various renewables, and there is many options, how can we make it more attractive for private investment to start to take up that burden? I was involved with a company a few years ago. We sold it to Shell. We really couldn't afford the risk. We didn't have a framework we felt secure. So what do we need to create that investment framework here in Australia?
May I?
Yeah, may.
The reality is we're beating investment off with a stick, but very successfully, by the way. So I guess let me lay my cards on the table. I'm not here representing the Queensland government or CleanCo, but I'm about to share some insights that come from running CleanCo. And CleanCo is a company tasked with integrating renewables onto the grid to support Queensland, achieving our sustainability targets in a way that still preserves the affordability and reliability of energy, and that actually translates our renewable bounty into regional growth opportunities and specifically employment. So let me break that down a little bit. We are tasked with using, indeed, Queensland's hydro assets, so hydro power plants up in the north of the state, a pumped hydro out on Lake Wivenhoe, and a gas plant, and I'll come back to that in a second, to back up wind and solar projects, new renewable projects, wind and solar developments at that kind of industrial scale, hundreds of megawatts, such that we can blend it all together and offer a big, sophisticated user of energy like BHP or Coles, two of our highest profile customers so far, energy that is 90% lower emissions than the grid and is cost competitive. So we've done that. That is a fact. We've sold it. It's happened. It wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago, but it is possible now. And that represents an absolutely essential tipping point in the uptake of renewable energy around the world, because it is now more economic to have low emissions energy than not. And that's just a game changer, right? And so there are a couple of things I want to point out about that. One is our assets, you'll notice, are very flexible. So the hydros, they work with gravity. You turn them on, and within at most a few minutes, sometimes within a number of seconds, you've got electricity. Our gas plant is very efficient, but it's also quite responsive. So within kind of 2 hours from a cold start, you can have electricity. And what that means is they are the perfect partners to variable renewable energy sources. So it's not a sunny day, no big deal. Not a windy day, no big deal. We've got it stored up. We can cover you and have kind of 24/7 electricity that's 90% lower emission than the grid. And I don't want to gloss over any of the challenges of doing that at a large scale. We're still a relatively small company. But the fact that we've done it and we are not receiving ongoing subsidies to do that means that tipping point has been reached. I will say that it is absolutely essential that we have Swanbank, our nice little gas plant, in the portfolio. There is absolutely no way that we could guarantee 24/7 electricity without it. We would have to build, I think I calculated at once, hundreds of Tesla batteries in order to make up for that one gas plant. And even that's not quite good enough. The reality is pumped hydro and batteries are perfect for storing the sunshine in the middle of the day by pumping water uphill or filling up your battery and then letting it run down overnight when you need the electricity. It doesn't help you when it hasn't been windy for a week and your hydros are empty and your batteries are dead. You still need something that you can flick the switch on. And so we do see gas playing a really important, small, but absolutely essential role in the energy transition, because we've got to have that certainty that we can have electricity even when it hasn't been windy for a week. And so I just say all of that to say that tipping point has been reached. The cost curves for solar and wind, and especially batteries, which are still earlier in their kind of cost curve cycle, are still coming down. And so if it's been reached already, it will be easy in the near future. That said, there is still a role for gas. And I do just want to pick up a point that you made, Hugh, about kind of the global context. I mentioned BHP. We're very proud to have BHP as one of our first customers. They have net zero commitments, and they look at their electricity as a way of getting there. Not the only way, but one of the biggest ways to get there, one of the earliest ways to get there, one of the ways that it's the most economic to get there soonest. In reality, 55% of the world's GDP comes from countries that have committed to a pace of decarbonization that keeps us on a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory by 2030. 55% of the world's GDP. And so I think we don't actually have to debate the things that we don't agree on about causality or severity to agree that that is a market force that Australia, is very, very, very small in the context of, notwithstanding the personal accountability to delete old photos. But it's kind of that scale. We are teeny little Australia. We are an exporter. This global dynamic will hit us, and the kind of the thing maybe that we can align on is that we actually are beautifully suited to succeed in that future world. We have the renewable energy. We have the critical minerals that will become only more important as the world decarbonizes, whether it's lithium or zinc or aluminium, some of the rare earth metals, cobalt, vanadium, these minerals that are essential for batteries, that are essential for making things lighter, that are essential for electronics. We've got them, and we've got the renewable energy to process them here. And so it's almost, it's economic today, it will be easy in the future, and we have what it takes to succeed in that global environment, whether or not you believe in what's driving it. That's the reality, and we have what it takes to succeed.
Yeah. So Graham, you want to comment on how do we get more public? Is it only going to happen through public investment, or can we really attract private investment into the space?
Well, if it's genuinely cheaper, then you'll get private investment. So if Maia's handing back all of her subsidies from the government and the industry gets rid of all those subsidies, and you're in business. You see an opportunity there, you'll take it. I just wanted to, though, you're looking for us to come to some agreements on things, and so I think there might be a possibility of us agreeing on nuclear here. I think Hugh's wrong. I think that there is a substantial number of Australians who are actually in favour of it. I think it's just slightly less than 50%. I did a poll myself. I have an online panel that I use, and it was about 47% on that, which I'd adjusted for voting preference. It's a bit complicated as to how I do it, and it's a model. So it's not going to be completely right, but it dovetailed in with other surveys that when I was looking at and saying, is this a reasonable result, they'd come to similar figures. I can send you the links to that if you're interested. And one of the points I make to people is that last year about 2% of Queensland's electricity for about 2 weeks was generated by nuclear power. And people look at me and I point out that the Ronald Reagan was birthed down in Hamilton. It's got 2 75 megawatt nuclear power generators on it. No one blinked an eyelid. And that's the kind of small modular reactors that Julieanne was talking about. They're basically taking that technology, building a nuclear reactor in a factory so you can keep the costs down. One of the big problems with nuclear is regulatory time periods, etc. It's one of the reasons the cost is as high as it is. With these, with a standard format, you can probably get around that. So I think we might have something there we might agree on. The other thing I think we might agree on is gas, because one of the problems with the renewables is that, as Maia pointed out, you can have a wind drought and a sun drought for quite considerable periods of time, and having batteries to back that up, or even pumped hydro. One of the issues with pumped hydro we've got is finding sites. I know of a few sites around, but there's not that many. I'm told that down in Tasmania, where they've got genuine hydro, they were talking about this Battery of Australia project, they called it, and I think they had 7 sites they were investigating. I'm told only 2 of them stack up. So I'd say that we probably agree that we need more sites for pumped hydro, and we need to do something about that as quickly as we can, because getting a dam approved in any sort of reasonable time period is very difficult. I've got a friend who's doing a dam up behind Bowen. I've got a memory lapse on the name of it. It's got about 8 hours, I think it is, worth of about 700 megawatt hours. So it's about 5,600 megawatt hours. So he's not even sure that that's going to come off. He's got a problem with a bum-breathing turtle, which might put the whole thing on hold. But there's not that many sites around. Though in the last election, the LNP promised 2 gigawatts of hydro up in what they called the New Bradfield scheme. Now, I never dug into that to find out whether that was realistic or not. It might have just been pulled off the top of their head, but I understand there is a fair bit of water runs down some of those North Queensland rivers on a reliable basis. So that could also be something that we agree might be a good thing to do.
Yep. Hugh wants to get his hand up. Yep.
Just on the hydro stuff, I think it's maybe, and I didn't realise until relatively recently, these pumped hydro storage facilities can be relatively small. So I'd have to say that I'm not an enormous fan of gigantic dams. Why? Because they fill full of silt, the world's, and they cause enormous problems for entire river systems. So we're already pushing many of our river systems to the edge. So if pumped hydro, I think, is all, the Baramba Dam they're talking about, these aren't enormous dams. You can get a lot of pumped hydro out of small storage facilities, even 20 or 30 hectare dams. The giga dams are threatening many aspects of Queensland hydrology, and one of our biggest problems is, like, the Burdekin is the biggest system close to the size and volume of the Murray-Darling Basin. Everybody thinks, why can't we just fill it full of dams and have lots of hydroelectricity and stuff like that? There's also enormous siltation rates. So many of our dams fill up at around about 0.5% to 1% a year. What do you do with that? So the world's dams volume is going down across the planet, despite all these dams. So and many of the times we don't actually have an integrated plan to put those dams in. So they get assessed one by one, whereas you can't assess a dam one by one. You've got to assess all the future dams that could, say, go into the Burdekin, and then work out which one is most appropriate. One of the tricks is called pumped augmentation, where you actually have one dam and you take water from 1 or 2 other river systems nearby, a bit like some, not quite the Bradfield scheme, but you move water around so you can actually have a smaller numbers of dams but use excess water on surplus flows from other dams, which is a great thing to do. That said, be careful Googling pumped augmentation. So don't go home and do it on your personal computer. It is a valid hydrological term, an engineering term, but it also, yep. Now your imagination is going to be going wild.
You're pissing your wife off again, are you?
Probably just change the topic slightly. Move it back onto a more serious thing. You're a dangerous person to have on a panel, Hugh. We mentioned somewhere along the conversation before, and again Anna Bligh mentioned it, is the potential of trade tariffs. against countries like Australia who are slower to make the conversion, and clearly countries like India and maybe China, Vietnam are all going to be much in the same situation. A lot of European countries, probably even us in America, a lot of us, we've exported a lot of our emissions to get advantage of lower costs of production in some of these countries. Now we're going to turn around and say, well, now you've got to increase your cost of production because we don't think you're moving fast enough. So should we be looking more at consumption rather than production as a way of measuring who is, who's on the, sort of the leaderboard when it comes to decarbonisation? So do you want to have a first go, Graham?
Yeah, I've thought that we should have been doing that all along, but I think I've got Buckley's chance of getting anyone to adopt it, because the dirty secret is that most countries that are boasting that they've lowered their emissions have actually just exported them and then they re-import them. So there's a little bit of a decrease, but not huge. So, the United Kingdom, for example, is in that position. So getting them to actually admit that really they haven't changed anything much, I think will be very difficult. When you talk about tariffs, I've been following that debate a little bit in the EU, and they're the first group that's trying to pull it on. They're getting quite a bit of opposition internally, particularly from manufacturing companies like car manufacturers, because when you do those sorts of things, you put up the prices for people internally, and if they have to export, then they've got they're losing price competitiveness with countries overseas that aren't subject to that. So, tariffs sound like a good idea until you start imposing them, and then you find that the costs actually impact more on the person imposing the tariffs than the other side, because they've got other people they can export to.
Okay, Maia, you want to have a...
Thank you. I think ultimately it's all emissions. It's all emissions, and it matters less who makes them. And I think getting into an argument over who is contributing what is only helpful for so long, and potentially waste some of those precious 9 years that we've got before we've used up our carbon budget. And so I'd make 2 points, and I would be interested whether they're points that we can agree on. One is that the tariffs are ultimately about pricing externalities, and it's not unprecedented. We now have expectations, not even that old, that if you're a company or a customer, in fact, that buys something from overseas, there has not been slave labor used in the production of that good. That's an expectation that we now have, I think has pretty broad support, and that we impose. And companies like mine, who might be 3 steps removed from the manufacturing of this good overseas, are accountable for following that whole supply chain down and saying, show me that you didn't use child labor, show me that you didn't use slave labor. That's our accountability, and we just accept that. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing with the carbon pricing as well, is recognizing that it's a funny thing about accounting, but for the last, I don't know, whenever modern accounting models were introduced, perhaps you can enlighten me on that, Hugh, we have discounted everything beyond 10 years out, effectively. We've discounted the value of clean air, we've discounted the value of clean water, we've discounted the value of clean lungs, and we've effectively discounted Earth to zero, and these trade tariffs seek to reverse that. And yes, they're new, but we've raised our standards and our expectations before in other areas, and this is no different. So I think that's the first point, is it's really an effort to price in externalities. Hopefully it doesn't get in to tit for tat, because ultimately it doesn't help us. Ultimately it's about all of our emissions, but in reality it's trying to price something that's really there, that's really happening. And the second point I'd make is, again, just that point that regardless of who imposes them or on what scope of emissions or when, the reality is that they will hit us here in Australia because we are exporters. And so the opportunity is not to focus on that and rail against it, but the opportunity is to be ready for it and make the most of it, to make it into an opportunity for us as opposed to a liability. Because again, we are uniquely well positioned, we have world-class resources, we have land to put it on, and we have desirable things to export into the future. And all of that together should equal, prosperity and opportunity for us. So that's where I'd love to see the focus of the argument, the focus of the debate is really how are we going to make the most of that, because it's coming to us whether we like it or not.
Any comments, Hugh?
I have a feeling the accounting system was invented by the Italians in Bologna, but is there an accountant in the room? Double entry. Yes, that's right. That was Florence. The accounting issue, I think I struggle with. I mean, or even some people want you to pay for the carbon that you dig up, which is probably the third and most difficult, challenging thing, particularly from a Queensland perspective. I agree with Maia. I think, and I'd probably even take it even a bit further, is regardless of the impact and the pace of climate change and all these things, I just think that I like to think Australians are the filthiest rich people in the planet. If you liquidate all our natural capital, we're ahead, I think. If you liquidate all our minerals and all those things, we have. So I sort of feel as though we have the responsibility to be the leader on this, and I think I agree we'd be benefit by being a leader, and I'd rather us be out ahead than coming number 27 in the world in terms of decarbonisation. My belief is I'd rather be winning that race because I think that it will bring long-term economic benefits, and we have a duty to be a leader in issues like this, social equity, treatment of Indigenous people, you name a whole series of things where the world has performed badly, biodiversity loss. I just wish we were we were number one.
I'm getting quite a few questions coming through, and I'm sorry, there's so many questions coming through now, the chances of asking each of them individually is going to be impossible, so I'm trying to get some clusters of thoughts, and there's a sort of a theme emerging at the moment about society and how it reacts. And I suppose there's a couple of things. There's the NIMBYism question, and I'll give you an example. They're setting up a renewable energy zone in Western Victoria, which seems a very sensible thing. It could be good, but to build a transmission line back into where it connects into the grid, there's massive opposition. Not to the renewables, but to the transmission line. We see the same thing with dams. We see, the same thing with so many other things. We also see, in some cases, a reluctance to pay the price that it might take to start to move us into that decarbonisation, the circular economy, and so many other things where we need to do at the moment. So is this a failure of leadership that we can't get, people to support, a vision in these areas, either to accept that they have to be part of the solution, or is there something else we can do?
I'll quickly
Graham.
go. I think goes to Graham's point about 50% of Australians may well believe nuclear is a good thing to do or not. I mean, the question then, I'll leave it with everybody, should every decision be made by the people of all Australians voting on it? No. That's why we vote them in once, and hopefully they make good decisions. So my view is leadership is actually doing many, many things that only 20% of Australians would believe in. So I don't believe in populism. I believe in electing a government, and if they do a shitty job, you throw them out, because we can't. And I fear at the moment that too many governments are looking over their shoulder and working out, are we in the 51% or 49%? I'd like to see leadership. And because I just don't think the average Australian is... I struggle to understand the topics we're discussing this evening. I just don't think the average Australian should have a say on most of these things. I think that they set up the broad objectives. We should have equity, we should have safety, we should have clean air. We could put point into the value system, but we're not there to make the micromanagement allocation decisions. I think that requires leadership.
When you talk about NIMBYism, one of my more interesting examples is that Bob Brown is campaigning against some wind farms in Tasmania because it's going to blight the landscape. I've also, from back in the early 80s, got a clipping where Bob Brown says, you don't need to dam the Gordon below Franklin, a small coal-fired power station would be the right answer. So you get some interesting positions on these sorts of issues, and it's politicians' jobs to negotiate around them. Now, if you keep making decisions the public don't approve of, you're not going to be an employed politician, or at least not employed to be in government for too long. So leadership only gets you so far. If by leadership you mean bravely defying the will of the public. I think I've got a dodgy line here. So that's kind of one issue. But the other issue I think we've got is too much leadership, in that we've got all these state governments and the federal government going in different directions and having conflicting policies. So, you know, the federal government says, yeah, we're going to meet our Kyoto undertakings, but the state governments say, oh no, we're going to get there twice as fast. And then they expect the federal government to run a federal system of electricity. You know, that just can't possibly work. So we're all fighting with each other and trying to get political advantage out of this climate change business. And, you know, I think that is a major problem, and we're not being straight and talking to people about what the real issues are. We're pretending that we can do things. We tell people that, oh, if there was more political will, we could get it done in 10 years. Well, that's nonsense. You just couldn't possibly build the infrastructure to do it in 10 years, even if you devoted all the resources of the economy to it. If you put Australia on a wartime footing, you still couldn't do it in that period of time. It takes time for things to happen. So we've got a lot of pretend going on at the moment, and I don't think that's very helpful at all.
Maia, the audience is warming up, so...
Well, I think it is beholden on leaders to make... It is beholden on leaders to make the difficult choices. I mean, we talked about certainty and uncertainty before. In what realm of decision-making do you have certainty? In what realm is that a reasonable thing to ask for? Do you have certainty when you go to war? Do you have certainty when you launch a new tax? Do you have certainty when you launch almost anything that has to do with human beings, right? And so you have to ask yourself, what are we relatively certain about? What do we have relatively high degree of certainty about? What are the realities that we're dealing with? I agree about the time that it takes to build things, although the message I take away from that is then I guess we better get started. But it is beholden on leaders, and I think what I'd love to see most is the language of possibility, the language of invitation, rather than the language of fear. And I think that's a lot about what was so appealing to come to this debate tonight. Is, you know, fear does not bring out our best characteristics. Optimism does, love does, and so where is the love in this future picture that we're heading towards? And I think it is beholden on our leaders to do the work, to translate what can be scary, what can be uncertain, what can be sad, into something that we can walk towards happily, something that we can walk towards with excitement, knowing that it's difficult, but knowing that it's worth the journey to get there. And I think of the example, forgive the yank bringing this up, but I think the example of Biden, right? As soon as he's elected, he walks out and says, when I'm talking about climate change, I'm talking about jobs. That simple, because he's done the work. He's done the work to figure out what it would take to make a net zero America. I think Robin mentioned that work. It's underway for Australia. It's similar to the work that we've done for Queensland. Done the work and seen where the job opportunities are, and he's gone to the coal-fired heart of Pennsylvania and sold that story and made it real and convinced the most skeptical person there that there's opportunity regardless of what you think about the uncertainties. And I think that's the opportunity for our leaders. How good would it be to have something that we were excited to go towards instead of all the things that we're afraid of falling into?
Yeah. There's been a couple of questions come through on the question of equity that, and I think comes back to your point, Hugh. We're probably a very privileged slice of Brisbane that are here tonight. We can afford maybe a solar panel. We can maybe afford an electric car. There's very large chunks of our economy and in other places that can't make those decisions. They can't opt to move themselves out into a cheaper energy mix. How do we make sure that there is not that structural damage left where there are people who are paying more for their energy because we've got to keep the grid reliable? How do we find a way to bring equity into this discussion?
I have not seen any of the modelling of various carbon or energy options and seen graphs of how equity changes through poorer regions, through rural regions, through different groups. So I think that needs to be part of the models. We need to know how inequities grow. I don't know. I don't know if they get worse or I don't know if they get better, to be honest, in terms of people. But, you know, that to me that is so important. How do you get equity? I used it today in a tweet. I mean, the government has to interfere because market forces will create inequities and those inequities will grow, and we have seen inequities in Australian society grow for 25 years, and I think we're heading towards, we need work to redress those issues. Tax is civilisation, and I suppose Graham might say we don't want too much interference from government. I just think government interference is essential, and I dislike the fact that government have walked away from doing much at all. Let the capitalists have their way, and that's what happened, 25 years of growing inequity. So I do think whatever, I don't know whether coal, gas, hydro, whatever is more or less inequitable, but I think there needs to be a heavy hand from government to make sure it doesn't create inequities between people, whatever path we do, and I don't see the modelling.
Yeah, on the issue of inequity, you don't address that through the energy system. It's wrong to say that there's been increasing inequality in Australia. The Gini coefficient's been remarkably stable for quite a period of time. Once you take transfer, well, it's a fact. There's not much point arguing about it.
Google it later.
And if you look at around the world, inequality has been decreasing. And it decreases as societies get richer. So what we have to do is ensure that our society maintains its standard of living. We need to worry about things like productivity. Our productivity's been dropping for a variety of reasons. You know, you need an economic system which is efficient and which delivers goods. You need things to be able to be competitive. You get inequality when people manage to carve out for themselves niches and use government regulation to protect themselves against competitors. You want an open economy where businesses can be challenged, where it's easy for people to set up new businesses, where finance is readily available. But they're all economic issues. Price of things like fuel may go up, it may affect some people more than others. You as a government will never be able to micromanage that to make sure that there are no losers. The market's the best way of sorting out those things. Those people will find ways of doing things more cheaply if they can't afford it. You'll probably, moving to electric cars, you'll probably find in 2040 there's still people driving petrol-driven cars. They might have a bit of trouble finding a fuel station by then, petrol station, but they'll still be built, still be driving them. There'll be a huge market that people will be servicing for replacement parts for cars that are no longer manufactured. There'll be engineering workshops turning those things out for the people that haven't been able to afford to move across. Eventually they will move across. You know, their standard of living will rise to a point, or the second-hand market in those cars will fall to a point where demand will meet supply. And that's how we've managed to create this incredible civilisation that we're in today. It wasn't done by governments. It was done by free exchange between free consenting adults.
We've spent a fair bit of time talking about energy. Maybe just move on to other sectors of the economy that are carbon emitters. Agriculture is an area that is hotly debated as to whether it should be included or not included. Yet it seems to me there's lots of opportunities around agriculture to be a genuine contributor to this discussion. But is that then offset by the way climate might be affecting where we can produce our food, and should we be adapting to those changes Whether the changes are good or bad, they are changing where we can live, perhaps, and where we can grow food. So who wants to go first?
Quick go. I mean, I think that climate change presents an enormous opportunity for agriculture, particularly, carbon capture and storage we haven't mentioned. What's the best carbon capture and storage device in the planet? It's called a tree, and it's been around for a long time. Bottom line is Queensland is huge. It's the 16th biggest country in the planet, and it's not all desert like South Australia, where I come from. The opportunities for sequestration, and we've already heard it in the soil and above ground sequestration, particularly to offset that last nasty 5 or 10% where we're needing to use gas to provide some of the base load, I think is enormous. In my previous job with the Nature Conservancy, the world's biggest environmental NGO, Amazon came through the door and gave us $100 million to go carbon neutral by 2040. So they're going completely carbon neutral by 2040, the whole of Amazon, one of the biggest companies in the planet. To your point, Maia, about industry pushing ahead on these issues. And they said, we want $100 million of biodiverse, rock solid, gold standard carbon in the ground. And we were working with them to deliver those outcomes through changed agricultural practices, fire management, reforestation and so forth. So, to my mind, that most of that $100 million, which they then promised $1 billion in the future of carbon sequestration, because their last bit of their offsetting was going to be extremely difficult, why isn't that money coming to Queensland? That's an enormous opportunity for our rural communities. And they will have to change. I agree, some of their agricultural practices. Species are moving up and down. But that said, Australian farmers are extremely adaptable. It's not so good if you have long-term perennial crops, but we can move our agriculture around. We've got the world's best agricultural scientists, in my opinions, so I think they're there to provide that sort of resources. They just need, in many ways, more certainty, and I do think that's where we do need more regulations, rules and clarity around how you're going to get these payments for carbon benefits, because I think it's going to be a big part of the Queensland economy in the future.
Anybody else want to make a comment?
I just wonder how many planets we're going to have to grow trees on to make up for carbon emissions. I think there are real issues with that approach. One way of looking at Australia is that we don't actually have an emissions problem because our population's sufficiently small that effectively our emissions can be absorbed by Australia itself. So one way of looking at the problem is this isn't really an emissions problem, it's an overpopulation problem. But the solution to that is not one that I'm going to go anywhere near. As I understand it, one of the issues with agriculture is flatulence. And I'm not sure I'm not sure why it should be the case that cows would be more flatulent than kangaroos, but someone might be able to help me out.
It's burping. It's not flatulence. It's far less naughty.
Burping, is it?
Yeah, it's burping. Yeah. And sorry, the tree comment's completely out of order. Australia's carbon emissions, when we were heavily clearing in Queensland, was 10% of the nation's carbon dioxide emissions from clearing of land. 10%, the equivalent of taking, and stopping that, if we can stop it, is the equivalent of taking half the cars off the road. So the land sector is not to be discounted.
And we've got 8 billion people on the planet. How are we going to feed them all if we stop people grazing and clearing and managing their land?
I'm not stopping anybody grazing. I didn't say I was going to stop anybody grazing.
And during that period, there was actually more regrowth.
We're feeding 10 billion people at the moment. So there's excess food production food starvation is not a volume production.
If everyone starts growing trees on their pasture, it will be a problem.
They want to grow trees on their pasture. They're reforesting as we speak. It's happening all over Australia. So just read the Financial Review last weekend.
Sure, if you pay them more to do that,
and they're being productive.
Then
pastoralists are being productive.
Yeah, but you keep growing those trees and covering that land, their productive capacity for cows will stop.
So?
Well, what are you going to eat?
10 billion people can be fed now, and the productivity of agriculture is enormous.
But if you keep tying up land by growing trees on it because of your emissions, then you're not going to have that same productivity.
And it goes into the soil, improves agricultural productivity, you get more food. There. Anyway, sorry, we're going off top, but like, I think the agricultural scientists have all agreed, the farmers have all agreed. I've met with AgForce, Queensland Farmers Federation. They're very keen on the carbon markets and they see growing food productivity with increased carbon on land.
I think AgForce are getting themselves jammed and they're going to have trouble with their members fairly shortly.
Yeah. Well, clearly that one was one we didn't agree on, so we will try and move on. As I said, we are still taking questions from the audience for another 5 minutes. But as I said, I've got so many here that I really can't ask them all. But one question has come through, and I suppose this is a little bit about climate change and the impact on sea levels, and some of the predictions that we have certainly seen through from the international organisations. And our responsibilities to, say, the Pacific Island families, clearly it seems to me to be cheaper to help them to stay home than to have to accommodate them if their land goes. So should we be doing more in our own backyard as well as what we're doing here in our own country?
Well, sea level rise is an interesting proposition. So the scary figures come out of models. The growth in sea level rise for about the last 100 years has been somewhere around 3 millimetres a year. There's been no increase in sea level rise, basically, on the east coast of Australia. The reason for that is that the continent's moving north and West Australian bit's tipping down, so you wouldn't want to be up near the top of, in your beachside property near the top of Western Australia, because they're going down about 7 millimetres, I think it is. But we've been going up, so that's cancelled out the sea rise. So you can look at records from Fort Denison down in Sydney, and it's been zero increase. So you'd need to get significant increase in ice melting. The ice that's on the water doesn't contribute to sea level rise, so most of the stuff in the Arctic, the polar ice cap, it's like the ice in your glass of scotch, doesn't affect the level. Antarctica is the one you've got to worry about. However, Antarctica is below zero most of the time, and even under your 1.5, 2, 3, 4 degree scenario, we'll still be under that. We'll be in a world with possibly more water in the atmosphere, meaning that there's probably going to be more precipitation down there, possibly more water being taken out of circulation than is actually going into it from melting around the edges. So, I'd wait and see on the water issue. In Australia, it affects towns that are ports, but towns that are ports are always going to be affected by sea level rises or decreases. If you were building a port in Queensland 15,000 years ago, it wouldn't have been in Brisbane, it would have been about 100 kilometres to the east, because that's where the sea was. We've had sea levels a couple of metres in the last 10,000 years higher than they are now. So that'd give us a little bit of trouble in Brisbane, but probably not that much of significance. When you look at the islands, the coral atolls have dealt with about 150 metres of sea rise over the last 15,000 years. The latest study that I saw, which I think was done by Auckland University, showed that most of those islands were actually increasing in size. So again, I'm not sure there's an issue there, and I'd wait till people came knocking on the door to see where they need help. I mean, I'd be very quick to move if there was a real issue, but at the moment, I haven't heard of anyone leaving any of those islands because they're genuine climate refugees.
Okay. Unlike some of the more uncertain aspects of climate change, the land mass of islands is something that's relatively easy to measure and track. So I might encourage some Googling on that one as well. But I think there are two things. First is the main cause of sea level rise is the ocean expanding. It's thermal expansion because the ocean is getting warmer, because the climate is getting warmer on average because of climate change, because of CO2. And so it's not actually just about the ice melting, although the reason that Brisbane would have been significantly inland is because all the ice from the last ice age melted, and that's why sea level rose. So I think it's worth just acknowledging how significant those changes can be. They are not linear. They're not linear, so it's not about watching a little iceberg get a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. There are effects on, ice shelves in Antarctica and in Greenland that are non-linear, and once they've passed, they're catastrophically passed. You can't glue the iceberg back on. It goes away and melts in the warmer ocean. So I think the risk is real, and the residents of those islands have said it far more poignantly than I ever could, sitting here on the nice, apparently neutral ground of Eastern Australia. But I think what the question kind of drives to beyond those physics is the moral obligation of those of us who have emitted the carbon, those of us sitting here in our privileged environment, to go and help out those who are now affected by it. And it's true for the Pacific Islands. It will be true for extreme climatic events, which we know will increase in both severity and frequency. We've seen that already. It's not that they never used to happen in the past. I think it was Robin who mentioned the flooding in Germany that happened 800 years ago. It's not that they've never happened. It's that they're going to happen more and more, and they're going to be worse and worse. And so those of us who caused it, those of us who are part of the system that caused it, those of us who live here our very comfortable lives as a result of 200 years of emitting that carbon, I think do have a moral obligation to go and help those who will be affected by it, even though they did not contribute. And so I think, the generosity and the open-mindedness that we need to show in that is, again, that leadership, that possibility of hope for those who will be the most affected by our actions.
Okay. I think I just got a super last question, which I think will be a good note to finish on. This question is saying, let's talk resilience rather than what's causing climate change. Let's just agree on that things are changing and what can we do. So we take that one by one. Hugh?
Yeah, I'm going to take a different tack on resilience. I think obviously we've had a lot of catastrophic events and fires, floods, cyclones, and just the warming water certainly has a big impact on that. But there are a lot of physical things we can do to build in resilience and economic things. I worry more about social resilience, I think, and something I'm not sure we fully understand. How do small communities deal with repeated disasters? Queensland is the state of disasters, you'll be glad to know. Apparently, I think 90% of the money spent on disaster relief largely happens here, and we have them all. We have everything from fires to floods to cyclones and the lot. So I think we have a lot to learn. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority, the fire services, the emergency services are really experts in this sort of space. And a lot of the interesting research is how do you create communities that unavoidably will be impacted, often by multiple disasters on top of each other? And why do some rebound quickly, rebuild their economy? And I think Queensland is a relatively resilient state and the people are relatively resilient. Where are the points where sometimes those small communities fall over, and what do we have to do to give them the resources so they don't fall over? And there's a lot amount of social science research to be done in that space.
Excellent. I might take a page from your book and talk about a different kind of resilience as well, which is economic resilience. Tonight, I think we've talked about tipping points a bit, and the sneaky thing about tipping points is that they creep up on you incrementally until suddenly they've passed and everything has changed. Those underlying governing dynamics have changed. And a couple have happened, and our resilience depends on our response to them. Our economic resilience depends on our response to them. So one is that as a species, our awareness of climate change has reached a tipping point, and I think we see that in the commitments that are made, the scale of the commitments that are made, the fearlessness of those commitments, even in the face of uncertainty. I think that represents a tipping point in our global consciousness. The second tipping point that I talked a lot about and that I deal with every day is that the cost of action has changed. It no longer costs us our prosperity or even necessarily our comfort to take action. And so when I think about resilience, I think, are we going to take those tipping points and give it a red hot go as Australia? Are we going to reindustrialize on the back of cheap, clean power? Are we going to build our economic resilience because the rest of the world is moving? And are we ultimately going to tap into what could be a sustainable source of prosperity That's the question. Are we going to grab that opportunity or not?
Okay, Graham?
I think the key to resilience is a richer society. If you look at graphs of the deaths from natural events over the last 100 years or so, there's a great site on the internet called Your World in Data, or Our World in Data. You'll see that as the world gets richer, the graph goes down like that. It's just a simple matter of, in a sense, common sense, that the more resources, which is what wealth is, the more resources we control, the more we can do about the more things. The better we can build houses so that they're more resistant to cyclones, for example. But those sorts of resilient systems and that sort of economy that relies on empowering individuals to look after their own interests and make their own decisions. It also relies on people being sufficiently well educated, and it also involves an honest conversation, because people have to actually understand truly what the options are and what the facts are, not have things pushed at them because it suits one interest or another. Now, it's very difficult to organise a society like that, but we in Australia have managed to do it, and we need to keep on doing what we're doing and valuing what we're doing. And this is a little bit off topic, but one thing that really annoys me about Australian politics at the moment is that there's a tendency from some quarters to put us down as a society, when in fact, when you look at all the societies they've been in all the time on this world, this is one of the best to be alive in. We're privileged, but we've earned that privilege too.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. I now know why we were wished luck before we were started, and I think it's just, you know, I just really appreciate, you know, you spending this time with us tonight, and to be honest and frank, it is a difficult discussion. It's going to stay difficult for a while, but I think, you know, I think pointing out the realities of what we're dealing with is one way to keep on moving forward so we can understand what's possible. So thank you very, very much. It's been a terrific discussion. So please, you know, thank our speakers for coming along tonight and putting themselves under the pump for well over an hour. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's my role now to draw the evening to a close, and you'll be pleased to know that as my professional background is in language neuroscience, there's no way I'm going to summarise any of the points that have been so eloquently delivered to us tonight. But I am going to try and pull some points together, and I'm going to be efficient, Hugh, by using a meta-analysis. So just work with me here to hover over what we've covered tonight, and I'll just pull out a few major points. Well, one of the most positive things in this meta-analysis that I've conducted is that I, and I know all of you, have gained new knowledge, a lot of new knowledge, and that's a tremendous thing for us to have acquired and to go away with tonight. Another part of the analysis is that I do believe that we have developed a more sophisticated cognitive approach to this debate about climate change and what we can and cannot agree on. So the cognitive strategies around sifting and prioritising and focusing, etc., we use every day, but I think tonight we've seen them at play and see and appreciate their importance. Another part of my meta-analysis was the privilege of hearing about the science, certainly, but also so much more that was brought up by our panellists and our moderator. And those other domains were about leadership and inequality and the tipping points and resilience. And it's exactly what we came here to listen to, about these blurry boundaries and how they intersect and bump off each other. And the panel called so many of them out beautifully. The final bit of my meta-analysis is the emotional and psychological one. And I can only speak for myself, but I do feel more optimistic about this topic. after tonight than when I walked in, mostly because of the quality of our panellists and their dedication to the area and what they represent in how we can move forward. So I think what we can all agree on, if not elements of the debate, is that we've been totally privileged tonight to be in the company of this high quality panel and to hear them present. So please join me again in thanking them. And on your behalf, they will all receive a token of appreciation off stage. Before I finally wind up, could I please repeat our thanks to the Tivoli. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Yes, isn't it beautiful? See you back here. See you back here and at the Princess towards the end of the year. To our volunteers and to you, the audience, for coming and participating in such a respectful way. So thank you. Yes, please. The Brisbane Dialogue team has asked me to announce that the next big dialogue will be on Monday the 15th of November. Gee, I hope it's free, everyone. Check your diaries, write it down. It's going to be at the renovated Princess Theatre in Woolloongabba, so that's very exciting. Topic to be advised soon. Put it in your diary and look out for the advance ticketing advice. And as the banner says over there, get involved. You'll notice on your tables that we've left some feedback cards. We would love for you to give us some thoughts about tonight, about what you liked and thought we could have done better, particularly about some new topics for the future. So please fill in those cards and leave them for us, and we'll make sure that we pick them up and review them. Also, there's an opportunity to partner and collaborate, volunteer or donate. So be a part of the solution. And please spread the word about the Brisbane Dialogues and the Big Dialogue series. Finally, no need to rush home. Stay for a while, carry on the discussion with your newfound friends, enjoy some good food and a couple of drinks. And finally, thank you to everyone and stay safe. Thanks.